Hi, everybody. As Kyle said, my name is Sonia Gupta. I was a lawyer for 8 years before I became a software developer. Now I'm a developer advocate at Influx Data, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about digital ethics in an unethical era, how to not ruin the world, hopefully. So a little bit about me. I was a lawyer for 8 years, as I said. I practiced in Louisiana during that entire career. I was a public defender in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and then I was a prosecutor. Then I practiced with the Attorney General of the state of Louisiana, doing civil rights and torts litigation. Most of my work, though, was in the criminal arena. And I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the things that we do as lawyers to put ethics at the forefront of our education and at the forefront of our practice as attorneys. So in the first year of law school, you learn ethics. It's drilled into your head from a very early part of your career to make sure that this is front and center in your mind. We take an ethics course in our first year. Then before we can actually be licensed to practice law, we take something called the Multi-State Professional Responsibility Exam, and that is a test on our legal ethics, whether or not we've actually learned what we're supposed to learn in our ethics course. And then for the rest of your career as a practicing attorney, you have to take ethics courses every year. So for every year that you practice, you have to take continuing legal education courses to make sure that you've retained your ethical practice, to make sure that you're still practicing ethically as an attorney. So a lot of legal ethics is actually pretty intuitive. Things like don't have intimate relations with your clients. That's a no-no. Don't intermingle client funds with your own, et cetera, things like that. But then why do we learn it as the first thing that we learn in law school? Why is it so important that they teach it in the first year of law school? Why do you have to take a separate exam and be tested on your ethical obligations? Why do you then have to take continuing legal education courses every year for the rest of your practice as an attorney? It's because this puts it front and center. It reduces the mental overhead of having to make ethical decisions when you're kind of under the wire, when you're under stress, when you're under financial stress, or you're under a deadline. You may be inclined to make unethical decisions. So if you're in a position where you've already had this ethical education and you've had an education in ethics, a strong foundation in ethics, then you're less likely to make those unethical decisions when the time comes to make the right decision. Doctors and lawyers know that they have a burden which transcends mere legal restrictions. So there's a difference between law and ethics, and we'll talk a little bit about that later in the talk. But the burden for doctors and lawyers in terms of the way that they treat their clients is much higher than it would be for your average human being. And that's because doctors, for example, hold human life in their hands, and lawyers often hold human freedom and finances, significant finances in their hands. So we understand that the repercussions of unethical behavior are quite high in those two professions. Now, what I've noticed is that it's becoming increasingly apparent that we, as technologists, also hold human life and freedom in our hands, and that we therefore need to hold ourselves to a very similar standard as that of doctors and lawyers when we conduct ourselves in our profession. One of the differences, though, is that doctors and lawyers interface with their end users on a regular basis. So when I was practicing law, I would interface with my clients on an almost daily basis. Doctors interact with their patients on a daily basis. We generally abstract our interaction with our end user into a machine. So we're generally interacting with machines or with each other, not so often with our end users. And what I think that means is that it makes us need to be even more vigilant when we talk about our ethical obligations to the rest of humanity. So part of that is learning about ethics. Part of that is making ethics front and center in our minds as practitioners and as technologists. So there are a couple of examples that we can follow, we can get some advice from. We can get advice from the legal profession, we can get advice from the medical profession. These are professions that have already kind of outlined their own ethical standards, and so we can borrow a lot of what they've talked about already, a lot of the things, the guidelines that they've outlined, we can borrow from them to make our own ethical guidelines as technologists. So this here is the Louisiana Lawyer's Oath. I know it looks like a wall of text. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I would just like to outline a few salient portions that I think that we can probably use as technologists. This line, I will not counsel or maintain any suit or proceeding which shall appear to me to be unjust, nor any defense except such as I believe to be honestly debatable under the law of the land. So this lawyer's oath, I took it in the Supreme Court before I was able to practice law, and this line really stood out to me. This is pretty simple. It's basically saying don't be an asshole. That's the simplest version of it. But really it's saying don't do anything that you know to be unjust, right? Don't pursue any cases that you know aren't worthy of the court system. This is something that we as technologists is pretty simple to apply, right? Don't do anything, don't write code, don't create infrastructure that you know to be problematic. Don't do anything that you know as a human being dealing with other human beings on a regular basis is something that's unethical. So this is just kind of appealing to your gut instinct about what you know is right and wrong. there's another passage in the lawyer's oath. I will never reject from any consideration personal to myself the cause of the defenseless or oppressed or delay any person's cause for lucre or malice. So this is actually saying two things. One, don't be an asshole. Two, you have an affirmative burden to actually be better than not being an asshole. You actually have an affirmative burden to the rest of humanity to help humanity, to not reject the cause of humans who are suffering. So that you actually, as technologists, also need to consider, I think, this idea that we have an affirmative burden to humanity, not only to produce code and to produce infrastructure that's ethical in the sense that it does no harm, but also infrastructure and code that actually helps humanity. And that's part of where ethics is differentiated from law. Law is generally proscriptive. It generally tells you what you can't do. Ethics is saying these are some things that you shouldn't do, but also the things that you should do. And I think that that's a higher burden that we have to hold ourselves to. Another example that we can pull from is the modern Hippocratic Oath. This is the oath that doctors take before they're licensed to practice medicine. And there are some salient portions in here that I think that we can learn from as well. I will apply for the benefit of the sick all measures that are required, avoiding those twin traps of overtreatment and therapeutic nihilism. What this brings to mind to me in terms of engineering is over-engineering and under-engineering solutions, that we have an ethical obligation to actually try our best to get it just right, not to do too much and not to do too little in the solutions that we create. Because when you do too much or when you do too little is when you invoke some sort of ethical gray areas. When you're doing just the amount that's required, you're less likely to skirt those ethical areas. This also says, I will apply for the benefit of the sick all measures. So it's asking you to do everything in your power, not just what you think you can do, but everything that's actually in your power as a technologist to do what is right by the rest of humanity. This one I think is really important. I see this a lot in our industry. As an outsider to the industry, I saw this, but now that I've been in the industry now for 3 years, I'm not yet an insider, I'm still a relative outsider, but I see a lot of playing at God. I see especially big corporations making decisions that have huge and varying impacts for the rest of humanity with reckless abandon. And this is playing at God. And one of the things that we have to remember on an individual level as technologists is that we are not God, that we are in fact fallible human beings who create code that has errors, that we create work that actually has repercussions for humanity that could potentially be dire, and that the work that we do matters and actually affects humanity. And then finally, in the Hippocratic Oath, I think this last passage, I will remember that I remain a member of society with special obligations to all my fellow human beings, those sound of mind and body, as well as the infirm. So this is actually, again, creating another affirmative burden to actually remind you that you have an obligation as an individual who's a member of society, not only to those who are well and able, but to those who are infirm. And this, again, creates an affirmative burden of doing good by those who are less fortunate than we are. If you're sitting in this room, you're probably a relatively privileged person. And what this is doing is placing a burden on us to account for the ethical behaviors that we engage in that might affect those who are less fortunate than we are. So given that law and medicine have all of these constraints at the forefront of their minds, lawyers and doctors have to think about ethical obligations in everything that they do on a daily basis, with every interaction with every client, every interaction with every patient, and this is an education that's drilled into them from the very beginning. What I was wondering, having done this research, was where does technology stand in relation to medicine and law in terms of ethical education? So I did the absolutely scientific thing, and I conducted a Twitter poll. So I got about 700 replies, almost 700 replies, and I asked if you had ever worked as a software or infrastructure engineer, did you ever receive any formal education in digital ethics? Almost 70% of the people that replied said no. That means there's a huge gap in our education. That means there's a huge gap in the amount of ethical education that we're receiving, in our exposure to ethics as a field, and that means that we're starting from scratch as an industry when it comes to understanding and practicing ethics. So clearly we have some work to do as an industry. So I think it might be useful to talk a little bit about what ethics even is, right? That's what this talk is about. It's not just some esoteric kind of vaguely defined thing. It's been around since ancient Greece, the study of ethics, and there are a few really good definitions of ethics that you can find online, but one that I think that is really good comes from the Markula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University, and it states that ethics is the well-founded standards of right and wrong that prescribe what humans ought to do, usually in terms of rights, obligations, benefits to society, fairness, or specific virtues. So again, there's that language, ought. This is not a prescriptive thing. This is saying this is what we ought to do, not necessarily just a baseline of behavior. This is holding us to a higher standard. Ethics is different from law in that way, that it holds us to a higher standard other than simply not breaking the law. So some of the things that you can think about when you're thinking about ethics are things like informed consent. Do we give our users informed consent? Lawyers, for example, if I wanted to represent two clients that have a conflict of interest, I'd have to educate them about that conflict of interest before I could represent either of them. And there are, in fact, some conflicts of interest that are so severe that I can't represent those two clients at all. So what we have to ask ourselves is when users are, for example, sharing their private data with us, are we giving them informed consent to share that private data? Do they know exactly what they're giving us? Do they know exactly what they're sharing with us? This is a privacy opting in, and creating an opt-out instead of an opt-in would probably be a more ethical decision than requiring our clients and our users to opt out of privacy regulations. So ethical regulations are also created with foresight. The foresight that humans have tunnel vision and don't make good decisions in the moment. Having these regulations in place and having an ethical underpinning, having an ethical framework from which to draw, reduces the mental overhead of having to make the right decision in the moment. Ethics is not only ethics, but it's also the study of ethics. And what this presupposes is that ethics is not fixed. It's constantly evolving. So we used to believe that it was ethical to own human beings. We no longer believe that to be ethical for the most part. So we have to understand that ethics is shifting and changing, and that these changes generally kind of coincide with social mores changing, social adaptation. We have things like the Supreme Court that has to be counter-majoritarian because it has to make decisions that may not always coincide with what humanity thinks is best. That these decisions are constantly changing. What we believe to be ethical is constantly changing. So we have to study that constant change. This is not something that you can necessarily set and forget and say, listen, I learned ethics, I'm done learning ethics, it's fixed now. Ethics is constantly shifting, so we constantly have to educate ourselves on it. So I think it's really interesting to understand how we got to what digital ethics is, separate from ethics as a larger umbrella category. Digital ethics is a subset of that, and there is a pretty interesting history behind digital ethics that I think is worth exploring to kind of understand how we arrived at where we are now. It's good to understand the history of where we came from. So it starts with this fellow named Norbert Wiener. We're going to start in 1948 with Norbert Wiener. He was a mathematician and philosopher at MIT, and he studied under some other influential philosophers, including Bertrand Russell. During World War II, he worked on automating the aiming and firing of anti-aircraft guns, and as he was doing this work, he realized that it had very serious ethical implications. The work that he was doing had very ethical implications for humanity, that there is a significant difference between a manual anti-aircraft gun and an automated aircraft gun, that the latter could do a lot more damage. And as he realized, as he was doing this work, the implications of what he was doing, he started to think about the ethics of what he was doing. His work in automation thus led him to information theory, which very loosely studies the transmission and use of information. Now, this might seem unrelated to ethics, but we're going to talk about how it actually is very related to ethics. After kind of coming across information theory and developing his own concept of information theory, he developed something called cybernetics, which sounds like something out of science fiction, but is actually a real thing that relates to ethics, and we'll talk about how it relates to digital ethics now. So what is cybernetics? That's Norbert Wiener. He looks very smug. I think he has a right to, though. He made some really important contributions to how we look at digital ethics. So what is cybernetics? It's how living organisms communicate with each other, how machines communicate with each other, and how information is harvested, transmitted, and processed, and feedback rendered. So the term cybernetics actually comes from Kubernetes, which is Greek for the helmsman of a ship. It's the very same namesake of our favorite orchestration tool. The term also relates to a steering engine, which is a power steering device to autocorrect rudders on ships. This brings to mind automation. So Norbert Wiener picked the term cybernetics very deliberately to invoke the helmsman of a ship and automation. So this idea of how information is harvested, transmitted, and processed, and feedback rendered kind of reminds me and makes us think of the processes that we engage in every day, the data structures that we're dealing with, the infrastructure that we're deploying. All of these things have to do with information that is harvested, transmitted, and processed, and the feedback that we're getting from these processes that we're engaging in. Another thing that Norbert Wiener kind of noticed and took note of was that biological systems tend toward compartmentalization. So if you think about a human cell, it's kind of the perfect small little compartment that interacts with other cells and communicates with other cells, gets feedback from other cells in order to complete its own functions. So too our organs. Our organs are individual compartments that communicate with other organs and get feedback from those organs. And then humans, we are all individual compartments that communicate with each other through various systems. So Norbert Wiener decided and came up with the idea that efficient interaction depends on established rules of communication and interaction between entities. So this idea that ethics has a lot to do not only with what is morally right and wrong, but that it derives from discerning which interactions are beneficial to the system and which are disruptive. So ethical interactions are beneficial to the system, unethical actions are disruptive to the system. And that ideally we as humans should regulate ourselves to achieve homeostasis in society. And homeostasis is the tendency toward a relatively stable equilibrium between interdependent elements, meaning individual humans in a society, especially as maintained by physiological processes. So homeostasis is usually used in a biological kind of terminology as a term in biology, but it's something that we can apply to systems in general as well. So Norbert Wiener came up with this idea in 1948, and then you would see digital ethics. This was sort of the foundation of digital ethics, the way that systems interact, and the way that components in a system interact. So he laid this foundation, and then you would see over history peaks and kind of ebbs and flows in the interest of digital ethics that would usually coincide with things like the dot-com boom, when technology would become more problematic. So this man named Luciano Floridi, who I believe he's at Oxford now, he's a philosopher there. He came up with something called information ethics. And this reminds me a lot of the work that DevOps engineers do in particular, and also makes me think of object-oriented programming. He said that all entities, be they living organisms or machines, are informational objects. And any object has data structures, and it has operations or functions, which are activated by interaction with other objects, and that define the object's behavior in relation to other objects. So he called this information ethics, and it was meant to be a system applicable to all sorts of kinds of ethics, not just digital ethics, but human ethics, legal ethics. And this is kind of a philosophical way of looking at ethics. You can see some similarities here, like I said, between object-oriented programming and this, as well as infrastructure. It also kind of brings to mind serverless architecture as well. So we have to think about some of the ethical considerations for machines and distributed systems. So this is not just a talk about our ethical obligations towards other humans, but it's a talk about our ethical obligations in building machines and building microservices architectures that can actually communicate in an ethical way with each other. So when you're talking about ethical considerations for machines and distributed systems, it might sound disingenuous to say that a machine could have ethics, right? Generally speaking, ethics is the purview of humans. For now. But if you keep in mind cybernetics, you can see we are moving towards a system where machine ethics will be a thing someday, and where machines and microservices will independently have to develop ethical frameworks within distributed systems and services architecture. Infrastructure will need to make ethical decisions based upon human programming. So for now, we can talk about cybernetic relationships, which come just before traditional ethics comes into the picture. And I think one of the best ways to explore that is to compare a monolith, a single compartment, with a distributed system, which is a number of different compartmentalized entities communicating with each other. So in a monolith, you have easier visibility into code interactions. It's all of your code is in one place. That makes it much easier to go through and understand. In a distributed system, you have various microservices that were built by discrete teams or discrete individuals, and they're meant to function and evolve independently, so you have less visibility into exactly how the system is working because you've now split out this larger monolith into distributed system. You lose some visibility into what's going on, and you lose some clarity about what processes are actually happening. In a monolith, you also have a centralized locus of control. So you know what's happening because everything's in one place, and your infrastructure probably reflects that. With a distributed system, you no longer have a centralized locus of control. Instead, you have these independent units that are scattered about that need to achieve homeostasis. Your infrastructure is probably also distributed as well, particularly with a cloud-based infrastructure. In a monolith, you have less tooling. You have more direct control. So in a distributed system, you probably have containers, you have orchestration, you might have infrastructure automation through tools like Terraform, and all of this creates another level of abstraction, which is another way that independent entities are interacting with each other. And then some more human ethical problems are things like third-party APIs. So let's suppose you're sharing information with a third-party API. How do you know what that third-party API is doing with your data? Are you sending them user data? What are they doing with that user data? How's the data being stored? Are you responsible for knowing that? And should you be responsible? These are all questions that you have to ask when you're talking about distributed systems that are functioning as independent entities. And then there are things like security and privacy. These are things that we consider now, but mostly we consider these things for profit reasons, not for ethical reasons. It is not profitable to have an app that is insecure. It's not profitable to have to disseminate your user information far and wide for anybody to use. We tend to think of these things in terms of profit and loss. We don't tend to think of them in terms of whether it's ethically right or ethically wrong to do so. There are also some ethical considerations for humans building distributed systems. So the first question that we might ask is, what kind of a product are we building? Are we building a product that's actually helpful to humanity or harmful to humanity? Is it ethical, for example, to build a product that coaxes a user into buying things that they don't need? I know of some apps like that. Who is using our product? So are we building apps for children? And what are we doing when we're building those apps for children? How are those apps affecting a child's life? That's one question we might ask. Who are we sharing user information with? This kind of goes back to the third-party API discussion. There's this idea of proximate cause in law that says that an injury can be the proximate cause, a cause can be the proximate cause of an injury rather than the direct cause if you can establish that there was enough of a lineage, a chain of events to establish that cause as a proximate cause of an injury. So are we engaging in anything where we might be the proximate cause of an injury even if we were not the direct cause of that injury? For example, with a third-party API that might be using data that we're sending them in an inappropriate way. Is our product being used to harm humanity? This brings to mind things like what's happening in the States with immigration and customs enforcement. Amazon's facial recognition software is being used by them to detain oftentimes innocent individuals who haven't done anything wrong. That's problematic. So is that software being used in an improper way? Is our product accessible to all users? Accessibility very much is an ethical issue. Are we building products that are accessible to everybody, or are we only building products that are accessible to a few? Another question, is our technical debt a barrier to making ethical decisions easier? So have we built in so much technical debt that at this point we now have to make the expedient decision rather than the ethical decision, right? That we have so much technical debt that we are at a point where we can't actually do what's right. We've built in so much debt that we have to do things quickly. We're under a deadline. We can't make the ethical decision that we actually just have to do what's fastest. And are we automating ourselves out of accountability? This is kind of the driverless car problem. And I think this goes for infrastructure automation as well. If you've automated everything to such a degree that you can't necessarily pinpoint where the failure happened, where an ethical failure happened, then who in fact is accountable for that failure? And then finally, are we too distant from the end user to make any ethical decisions in the first place? And I said this at the beginning, that doctors and lawyers interface with their clients and their patients on a regular basis, but the work that we do largely abstracts that interaction into a machine. So are we too distant from our end users to actually understand what might be ethical for them in the first place? So I have a few suggestions on how we can change this. I'm not just here to talk about ethics and how everything is broken. Everything is broken, by the way. We very much need to fix things. And I think we're at a turning point right now where if we do receive more ethical education, we can actually become more responsible developers and infrastructure engineers. But I do have some suggestions that we can implement now that might help us to become more ethical developers and DevOps engineers. So the first would be to stop moving fast and breaking things. This is the antithesis of ethical development, but it's something that I think a lot of people associate with agile development. It doesn't necessarily have to be. Agile is about moving quickly, but agile can also be about doing the right thing. It can also be about moving ethically. So other professions recognize that maximizing profit isn't the end-all and be-all. So lawyers and doctors are held to ethical constraints. There are plenty of things that I could do as a lawyer that would make me like millions of dollars, but they're unethical for me to do so, and I could be disbarred for doing them. The same with the medical profession. There are probably weird surgeries that someone might want that a physician could conduct, but that would be unethical for them to do so. they can't do them. They could possibly lose their medical license for doing so. So there are these regulatory agencies that guard that, and there are ethical constraints that guard against that moving fast and breaking things kind of mentality. It's this mentality which leads to ethical failure on a grand scale, because no one stopped to think whether we should do a thing, even if we can do a thing. And that's a problem. So moving fast and breaking things is a sure way to avoid ethics. Another suggestion I have is initial education and mandatory yearly training. So initial education, regardless of where you enter this field. So I went to a code school. I really think I should have received some education on ethics at that code school. I also think computer science undergraduates probably need to receive ethical education, and there needs to be continuing education throughout the life cycle throughout your career as a developer and as an infrastructure engineer. You need to continue to receive mandatory yearly training if you want to continue your practice. And there's also, this is kind of controversial, maybe external regulation. So a lot of algorithms are obviously intellectual property, but maybe your intellectual property doesn't matter if it's going to screw humanity, right? That might... that might be something that needs to be subject to review either by the industry itself. So we either need to learn how to self-regulate, or we need to open ourselves up to governmental regulation. Which one would you rather? So it's time to kind of maybe think about external regulation with independent boards to review algorithms to make sure that they're not conducting any kind of unethical behavior. Another idea that you're accountable to humanity, not just the company. So oftentimes I think we get this tunnel vision. I know that I have when I was working as a developer, that you tend to believe that you're beholden to this particular feature cycle needs to be completed. I need to, get this story done. I'm under a deadline from this project manager. You're not just beholden to the company, you're beholden to all of humanity. The things that we build are affecting human lives in very real ways, even if it doesn't seem that way. Even if you're working on something that seems like a simple, harmless mobile app, what you're building is affecting humanity in a substantial way. And so it's important that you remember on a daily basis that you are beholden to humanity and not just the company. It's not just the company's bottom line that matters. Things like always requiring users to have to opt in. I mentioned this before when you're doing privacy disclosures, when you're collecting user data, requiring users to opt in rather than requiring them to opt out. And also maybe making some ethical choices for your users. So lawyers and doctors recognize that sometimes our clients and patients don't always know what's best. Just because my client might want me to take a certain course of action doesn't necessarily make it right for me to do so. I have to make some educated and informed decisions on behalf of my client as a lawyer. Sometimes we as an industry need to make educated and informed decisions on behalf of the people that are using our apps. Maybe just because someone wants an app to do a certain thing or to function in a certain way or to make them addicted to this app doesn't mean that we should allow that to happen. So we may need to make some decisions for our users because our users don't necessarily always know what's best. Now, this last one is really important. It might seem disconnected, but without it, there's really nothing that we can do, and ethics doesn't actually matter. Because if we live in a system while this is still in place, then no ethical constraints that we build will actually be effective. So this is one that I think is the most important. I think that if we have a code of ethics, if we craft a code of ethics that we're all expected to abide by, but that code of ethics is crafted in a white supremacist system, then there will be white supremacist implications baked into that code. One of the examples that I can give you is the Association for Computing Machinery, ACM, which most of you have probably heard of, has a task force of 25 people that rewrote their code of ethics last year. I looked at that task force, and of those 25 people, only a single person was not white, and that was a man of South Asian descent. And I looked at the code, and it doesn't really make any reference to underprivileged individuals. It doesn't really make any reference to social justice initiatives. It may not have been a concern of the board that wrote this code, but I think it is a concern that we actually need to address. The other thing that I'm concerned about in white supremacist systems that I saw as a lawyer was the unequal application of laws. And in this case, it would be the unequal application of ethical codes. So what I saw as a lawyer on a regular basis in southern Louisiana, I mean, you can imagine, was white people being treated very differently from black people in the criminal justice system. And what I worry about in a white supremacist system, if we have ethical codes codes of ethics that we've drafted with the intention of governing our behavior, that those codes will be applied differently for different people. So for example, will Mark Zuckerberg, who's a multi-billionaire, be treated the same way as a young black woman who's just built a startup when both of them have committed the same ethical infraction? Will they both be treated the same way? My worry is that in a white supremacist system, the answer is no. So systems of oppression don't dismantle themselves. The work has to be done by people who've built those systems. And people of color struggle to dismantle white supremacy. I would say that the onus is on white people to do the work to dismantle their own internalized white supremacy, but also for people of color to do the work in ourselves to dismantle our internalized white supremacy. This is the kind of work that I've had to do, that I do on a daily basis. If you follow me on Twitter, you'll know that I talk about white supremacy a lot. And that's because I think it's probably the most pressing scourge that the globe is facing now. And one of the things that I talk about is that my own kind of struggle with my own internalized white supremacy has been a lot of work for me to overcome that, and I'm still doing it on a daily basis. It makes me really uncomfortable even to stand here and talk about it. I get this tightness in my chest because doing this kind of work is uncomfortable, but it's absolutely necessary. And my kind of what I want to leave you with is that ethics doesn't matter at all if you haven't done the work to dismantle your own internal white supremacy. These systems don't dismantle themselves. It takes external effort. It takes concerted effort to dismantle these systems. So I want to leave you with some resources, and I'll be publishing these slides so that you'll be able to see all of the materials that I looked at to get my research on digital ethics, on Norbert Wiener, on Santa Clara's Markula Center for Ethics, on their definition of ethics, and also some books. If you're interested and you are a scared white person, I have some suggestions for things that you can read and listen to. The first is a podcast from Scene On Radio called Seeing White, which will actually teach you about the history of whiteness and the fact that whiteness was created as a construct to justify slavery. Maybe some people in this room didn't know that. I didn't know that until I listened to that podcast. So you'll learn about the history of whiteness. Another book that you might want to read is So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. That will make it easier to have conversations about race, which is one of the surest ways to start dismantling white supremacy. We have to have these conversations. They're very uncomfortable conversations, and you're going to screw up, but it's okay. And this will kind of teach you how to have those conversations in a productive way. And finally, a book called White Fragility, which I think should be read by people of color and white people alike to understand where defensiveness comes in when you're having these conversations and how to combat that defensiveness, because until we overcome that, we can't break down these systems. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you for listening to me, and it's been a pleasure to be here.